Hey y'all, it's Miss Osborne coming to you live from my house. Thank you for joining us for another WSQ. Today we're going to be looking at the New Deal. As you watch the video, make sure that you answer the guided questions provided. It's okay if you have to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer the guided questions. After the video is over, make sure that you summarize the main points of the video using paragraph form. These specific vocabulary is going to show up during the video as bolded and underlined words. And then don't forget to ask one question at the end, either something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question to bring back to the class. The essential question that we'll be answering during this video is, how did the U.S. government respond to mass unemployment and social upheavals caused by the stock market crash? Threat historians will analyze how patterns of exchange, markets, and private enterprise have developed and analyze the ways that governments have responded to economic issues. Foreign historians will also explain how different beliefs about the federal government's role in the U.S. social and economic life have affected political debates and policies. During the election of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, replacing Herbert Hoover. During his campaign, he promised relief, recovery, and reform programs that would help the American public. These were the three goals that he set out to accomplish during his New Deal. He had attacked the Republicans' response to the Great Depression that was led by Herbert Hoover, and he won by a landslide. Remember, a lot of American voters didn't really like Herbert Hoover. They thought he was being too optimistic. He didn't give them the handout that they wanted. Roosevelt had a personality that appealed to the American public. Overall, he was very optimistic. He was the first president to use the radio to connect with Americans in his fireside chats. It was as if that he was sitting there on the couch in the living room with Americans. He also believed that it was the government's duty to provide direct aid to the American people, and direct aid is what the American people really wanted. After the stock market crashed, a lot of people had been running to the banks, literally and figuratively, to try to take all their money out of the banks because they thought that the banks were not going to have any more because they were going bankrupt. So Roosevelt, in order to prevent this issue, called it a bank holiday and temporarily closed the banks so that people couldn't go take out their money. After this, he pushed through the Emergency Banking Act that gave the government the ability to examine each bank, to take steps to fix the banks as if there was anything there, and then if it was necessary, absolutely necessary, to close that bank because it wasn't healthy enough. The plans worked, and the banks began to reopen, and a lot of Americans started to put their money back into the banks. The Glass-Steagall Act created this FDIC. A lot of you might see like the FDIC plaques when you go to the banks. They say that your money is insured up to a certain amount. It essentially provides government insurance for anybody who's putting money into the bank, so they don't have to worry about that money suddenly disappearing like a lot of Americans did during the Great Depression. So there's 6 main programs that you need to know when it comes to the Great Depression. Here's a couple of them. The CCC, the AAA, the NIRA, the FSA, the SEC, the TVA. If you notice, all of these have different acronyms. A lot of the government programs during the New Deal were known as alphabet soup because all the letters of the alphabet were used. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a relief program that employed young men on conservation projects. You remember, one of Roosevelt's, his old Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's, his plan was to conserve the environment. The AAA was trying to help farmers recover from a lot of the high tariffs and try to convince them to grow fewer crops so that the prices of those goods would go back up. Less supply equals higher prices. The NIRA was a recovery act that wanted to help the businesses work with each other and then set prices and levels of production. It also includes the Public Works Administration that provided jobs for a lot of Americans. The Federal Securities Act forced companies to share certain financial information with the public. This is what we require with a lot of the public corporations now to make sure that their money is being spent wisely and appropriately. The SEC is also still around today, and it watches over the stock market, ensuring the health and making sure that the different spending is being legally done. And the TVA employed thousands of workers to develop dams and other public work projects for Tennessee. All the other states also had similar organizations, but the TVA was the first of its kind. After the first 100 days, Roosevelt continued to pass legislation that would help. The Civil Works Administration provided work for 4 million Americans that were building infrastructural projects. In addition, the Indian Reorganization Act limited the sale of Indian lands and also gave more assistance to these Native American groups to develop their own resources, their own economy, and keep their culture. Once Roosevelt was reelected, He came up with a couple of issues that were affecting his effectiveness. The Supreme Court were starting to find parts of the New Deal unconstitutional, saying that they took too many liberties and gave the government too much power. A lot of liberal people still wanted the Democrats to do more and wanted Roosevelt to do more. And when he was elected for a second time, they called this the second 100 days, and he also calls this the second New Deal. The second New Deal wanted to expand the most successful programs, the work relief programs that were employing Americans to do jobs and giving them a paycheck. The Emergency Appropriations Act, and one of the most famous of all programs during the New Deal, was the Work Progress Administration. 8.5 million Americans were employed to do public works projects, including parks, zoos, oral history of slaves, and other art projects. Photographers, artists, everyone who had an ability to be employed with this program. Americans really appreciated these types of programs, the work relief, because they were able to get a paycheck and actually work for something rather than just getting a handout. One of the most long-lasting New Deal programs was the Social Security Act. As many of you know, we still have it to this day, but the Social Security is starting to run out. It set up pension or regular payments for Americans that are 65 or older, one of the most poor populations of people overall, because once you can't work anymore, you depended on your families back then. This also includes unemployment insurance, that if you are out of a job, that you can use while you're looking for a job, so that you're not sinking back into poverty. Roosevelt has to end up raising taxes in order to fund the Social Security Act. But in order to make sure that he doesn't have to do that, some groups are left out. So anybody who's a farmer, some government employees, and also household workers, meaning like housewives and people like that, are left out of the Social Security Act. Many businesses start to ignore some of the regulations that were passed during the New Deal on unions. Remember, people don't really like unions during this time period. They think that they're too radical. The Wagner Act outlawed a number of anti-labor actions and also set up the Labor Relations Board and gave the government more power to protect workers. The AFL had been the largest union in the country, but it looked down on the unskilled or immigrant workers. The CIO, the Committee for Industrial Organization, rose to challenge the AFL. And they helped to organize unskilled workers as well. After one of the biggest strikes that happened was when they were helping with the General Motors strike. And after the General Motors strike, the CIO is going to win a lot more victories for their workers. In a last effort to satisfy Americans before the election of 1936, which would have been Roosevelt's third election, he passed the Rural Electrification Act. And this increased electricity availability to 90% of Americans. Before this, rural Americans really didn't have as much opportunity to get electricity because they were too far out of the cities. The economy had finally taken a turn for the better, and unemployment was down to 10%. Remember, at the height of the Great Depression, unemployment had been up to 25%. American voters really had no problem voting Roosevelt in for his third term in 1936. African Americans had often started to switch from being Republican after the legacy of Lincoln to starting to be Democrats. However, there was still a lot of court rulings against his New Deal. They had started to rule a lot of these unconstitutional, and so Roosevelt decided he was going to take matters into his own hands. So he tried to pass a resolution that would add 6 new judge positions to the already existing 9, and he also wanted more power to appoint new judges. He was only doing this to really get some of his New Deal legislation passed. And so people saw right through this, and they were really, really, really skeptical of this. And people began to desert him, and he lost a little bit of respect for that move. Finally, the New Deal ended with the Farm Tenancy Act. It was helped to pass to aid tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Many of these tenant farmers and sharecroppers still existed in the South. A lot of them had been pushed off of the land due to other New Deal projects, but this Farm Tenancy Act gave them the opportunity to buy land of their own. The New Deal started to also have wins in the Supreme Court that enabled him to move forward. However, by 1937, there was a drop in the economy, and so we feared that we were going to have a deficit in the economy. A deficit meaning that there would be more money owed than money being put in. By the end of his second term, the positive feelings about Roosevelt and the New Deal had really begun to fade. There was not a lot of people that were against the New Deal, but there were some. 4 of the main critics were Huey P. Long, Charles Coughlin, Francis Townsend, and the American Liberty League. and each of them had a group that they wanted to support more. Huey P. Long believed that the policies that Roosevelt was passing were too friendly with banks and businesses. He thought we should be giving more money to families. He advocated for an organization to provide every family with $5,000 to buy a home. And he thought that we should do this by taxing the wealthy. Now, mainly Republicans are not going to be for this plan. Charles Coughlin was a religious leader during this time period, and he was very critical of the president over the radio. Francis Townsend criticized the New Deal for not doing enough for older Americans. He wanted to expand Social Security. And the American Liberty League spoke on the behalf of a lot of conservatives who felt like the New Deal had gone way too far. The New Deal was also really great, and Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was really great because he also expanded roles for women. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, became an important figure advocating for women's issues. Frances Perkins became the first woman Secretary of Labor. There was also some more opportunities for African Americans as well. African Americans started to be appointed to many federal positions. An unofficial group called the Black Cabinet started to advise the president. However, there was a lot of discrimination still left over from in the South especially. The relief programs had successfully helped a lot of Americans get some sort of relief from poverty, and a lot of these are going to become a permanent fixture in American government and American society. Social Security and unemployment insurance, for example, still exist. The New Deal is really not as successful at recovering the American economy overall because unemployment was still high, but the New Deal reforms are going to be really long-lasting. The FDIC, for example, is still around to this day. The New Deal has a lot of mixed results. Some people think that it was really helpful. Some people think that it didn't do enough. But overall, it had a lot of really good things by developing internal improvements for the Americans, like roads, bridges, dams, and also a lot of public buildings. The New Deal also, the biggest impact was that it changed the relationship between government and citizens. It expanded the role and made the role for government a lot larger than it had previously been. And we got away from the laissez-faire, the hands-off economic policy we had in the 1920s. The country had a sense of optimism with the New Deal had ended by 1938. Republicans and Southern Democrats had called Roosevelt out. He didn't cut taxes. He didn't balance the budget. And American attention really started moving farther away from domestic issues and more toward the growing conflict in Europe that would end up resulting in World War II. As you watch the video, make sure that you answered the guided questions provided. It's okay if you need to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form. Make sure you go back and look at that specific vocabulary that appeared as bolded and underlined words during the video. And then finish by asking one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. Thank you for joining me for this video, and I'll see you on Monday.